This video is brought to you by Star Conflict, a free, fast-paced online space action game featuring large-scale battles. Play Star Conflict for free and support this channel and get a Black Hawk spaceship and a 3-day account boost as a bonus. Link below. In the early 1960s, international communications were limited to transmissions through undersea cables or occasionally unreliable radio signals that were bounced off the ionosphere. As you might imagine from this, many in the Western world weren't too keen on the state of the situation, given that were someone, say the Soviet Union, to cut the cables before launching an attack, international communications with overseas forces and foreign allies would have to rely on the mood of said ionosphere. For those unfamiliar, the ionosphere is a layer of the upper atmosphere, about 50 to 600 miles above sea level. It gets its name because it is ionized consistently by solar and cosmic radiation. In very simple terms, X-ray, ultraviolet, and shorter wavelengths of radiation are given off by the sun and from other cosmic sources, and they release electrons in this layer of the atmosphere when these particular photons are absorbed by molecules. Because the density of molecules and atoms is quite low in the ionosphere, particularly in the upper layers, it allows free electrons to exist in this way for a short period of time before ultimately recombining. Lower in the atmosphere, where the density of molecules is greater, this recombination happens much faster. Alright, so what does all of this have to do with communication and radio waves? Without interference, radio waves travel in a straight line from the broadcast source, ultimately hitting the ionosphere. What happens after is dependent on a variety of factors, notable among them being the frequency of the waves and the density of the free electrons. For certain types of radio waves, given the right conditions, they will essentially bounce back and forth between the ground and the ionosphere, propagating the signal further and further. So clearly, the ionosphere can potentially play an important part in the terrestrial radio and communication process. But it is the constantly shifting nature of the ionosphere that makes things really interesting. And for that, we're going to have to get a little bit more technical, though we'll at least spare you the maths and we'll leave out a little of the complexity in order to not go full textbook on you here. To begin with, the ionosphere's composition changes most drastically at night, primarily because, of course, the sun goes missing for a little bit. Without as abundant a source of ionizing rays, the D and E levels, pictured here, of the ionosphere cease to be very ionized, but the F region, particularly F2, still remains quite ionized. Further, because the atmosphere is significantly less dense here than the E and D regions, it results in more free electrons, the density of which is key here. When these electrons encounter a strong radio wave of certain types, such as AM radio, they can potentially oscillate at the frequency of the wave, taking some of the energy from the radio wave in the process. With enough of them, as can happen in the F layer, when the density of encountered electrons is sufficient relative to the specific signal frequency, and assuming they don't just recombine with some ion, which is much more likely in the E and D layers in the daytime, this can very effectively reflect the signal back down to Earth at sufficient strength to be picked up by a receiver. Depending on conditions, this process can potentially repeat several times, with the signal bouncing down to the ground and then back up again. Thus, using this skywave, certain radio signals can be propagated even thousands of miles, and most pertinent to the topic at hand, across oceans. Of course, given the unpredictability of this form of communication and potentially even times when communications would be impossible, military brass during the Cold War wanted another option. Developed at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Lincoln Labs, the project was initially called Project Needles by Professor Walter E. Morrow in 1958 when he first dreamed up the idea. It was later renamed Westford, presumably after Westford, Massachusetts, a nearby town. The idea was to place potentially even billions of tiny 1.78 centimeter, that's 0.7 inches long, and microscopically thin copper antennae or dipoles in a medium Earth orbit to be used for communication signals at 8 GHz. The first set of well over 100 million needles was launched on October 21, 1961, but unfortunately this test failed when the needles didn't disperse as planned. On a second attempt, on May 9, 1963, a batch of 350 million needles was placed in the back of an Air Force satellite and sent into orbit. Once dispersed, probably this time, the needles spread to form a sparsely concentrated belt with approximately 50 dipoles per cubic mile. While you might think that surely this wouldn't be dense enough to be effective for use in communication, in fact, early results of the experiments were extremely promising, with communication established using the needle array from California to Massachusetts, some 3,000 or so miles, or about 4,800 kilometers apart. As such, there were reports that the Air Force was considering launching 2 more belts to be placed more permanently in orbit. There was a problem, however. Beyond the Soviets, allies and even Americans opposed the further deployment and continuance of the program. Why was that? Well, astronomers in particular were afraid that the belt would interfere with their observations. The outrage of scientists, and the reason for it, was perhaps best expressed by Sir Bernard Lovell of the Jodrell Bank Radio Observatory, who said, "The damage lies not with this experiment alone, but with the attitude of mind which makes it possible without international agreement and safeguards. After all, the space above the Earth is not the United States' alone to do with whatever it pleases." While you might consider this a bit of an overreaction, it's important to understand the context here, with the US up to and around this point having done a series of things in space without oversight of the international community. For example, consider that also smack dab in the middle of this time, the United States was busy accidentally nuking Britain's first satellite, among many others. The satellite in question was the Ariel 1, which was developed as a joint venture between the United States and Britain, with Britain designing and building the core systems of the satellite, and NASA launching it into orbit via a Thor Delta rocket. Around 9 months after the launch of the first batch of needles on July 9, 1962, mere weeks after Ariel 1 was put into orbit and had successfully begun transmitting data about the ionosphere back to Earth, British scientists were shocked when the sensors aboard the Ariel 1, designed to measure radiation levels, suddenly began to give wildly high readings. As it turns out, as Ariel 1 was happily free-falling around the Earth, the US military had decided to detonate an experimental 1.4 megaton nuclear weapon named Starfish Prime in the upper atmosphere as part of Project Fishbowl. The explosion, which happened on the other side of the planet Ariel 1, sent a wave of additional radiation around the Earth that ultimately damaged some of the systems on Ariel 1, particularly its solar panels, killing it and about 1/3 of the rest of the satellites in low Earth orbit at the time. Most pertinent to the topic of communications, this famously included the Telstar satellite, which was the first commercial communication relay satellite designed to transmit signals across the Atlantic, and managed around 400 such communications before the US accidentally nuked it. Funnily enough, the Telstar wasn't actually in orbit at the time of the explosion, being put there the day after the Starfish Prime detonation. However, the additional ionizing radiation created by the explosion took years to dissipate and was not anticipated by the designers of this particular satellite. The immediate results were the degradation of Telstar's systems, particularly the failure of several transistors in the command system, causing it to stop working just a few months after being placed in orbit. They were eventually able to get it back online for a short period via some clever software workarounds, but it didn't last long thanks to the extra radiation further degrading the systems. It's also noteworthy here that the Starfish explosion was actually supposed to have happened a couple of weeks earlier on June the 20th, but the rocket carrying it failed at about 30,000 feet. Once this happened, the self-destruct on the nuclear warhead was initiated and it broke apart, raining its radioactive innards down on Johnson and Sand Islands. It should also be noted that the effects of Starfish Prime weren't just limited to low orbit. The electromagnetic pulse created by the blast ended up being much larger than expected, and in Hawaii, some 900 or so miles away from the blast, the pulse ended up knocking out a few hundred streetlights and damaged the telephone system. Today, in our digital world, of course, a similar electromagnetic pulse would have much more catastrophic effects, especially if near more populated centers, potentially even revealing the lizard people's matrix, which would be catastrophic to our draconian overlords' plans. May they reign forever. Needless to say, this, the Needles in Space, and other such projects had many in the international community concerns with the lack of oversight on the United States' activities in space. Presumably, it would have been even worse had everyone realized the United States had, in fact a few years before this, planned to nuke the moon, more or less just because they could. So going back to the needle issue, a compromise measure was reached thanks to incorporating a sort of planned obsolescence. That is, none of the needles would remain in orbit longer than 5 years. Or so they thought. There's more on that in a bit. Thinking more long-term, several groups of scientists, including the International Astronomical Union, IAU, and the Committee on Space Research of the International Council of Scientific Unions, demanded access and consultation in this and other such projects in the future. Ultimately, an agreement was reached which granted the scientists the ability to participate in the planning and evaluation of space projects. Of course, this particular issue quickly became moot as shortly after the second group of needles was dispersed, the military deployed its own first communication satellite system in 1966, making the needle system, while effective, just obsolete. With this deployment of one object instead of hundreds of millions, the furor died down and people, for the most part, just forgot about West Ford. That said, while the project is largely forgotten, its effects are not, with the consultation provisions ultimately helping form the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, an agreement entered into by 99 countries. This was designed to protect against the militarization and degradation of outer space. Among other things, in a nutshell, it provides that no country can claim ownership of space nor any celestial bodies. All countries will avoid contaminating both and are liable for any damage they cause. No weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, will be deployed or placed in orbit or on any celestial body, and no military bases may be placed on any celestial bodies, including the moon, something that unfortunately saw a planned military installation by the US fully scrapped, as we covered in our video that time the US was going to build a massive death ray-equipped military moon base. On the bright side, the treaty also includes a Good Samaritan law that provides that astronauts are envoys of mankind in outer space, and all shall render to them all possible assistance in the event of accident, distress, or emergency landing. Going back to the needles again, in case you're wondering, despite the planned obsolescence, as of 2019, a few dozen clumps of them remain in orbit and are closely tracked to make sure they don't cause any problems with all the other stuff floating around our little beautiful spacecraft known as Earth. And speaking of spacecraft, let me tell you a bit about today's sponsor, Star Conflict, before we get into today's incredible bonus facts. In Star Conflict, you can take part in epic space battles where you can fly over 240 different spaceships from 4 different factions. Now, there are loads of different ships to choose from, and you can really find something that matches how you like to play. Maybe you're a kind of big old destroyer type of person, or maybe you'd like a smaller, nimbler interceptor. Like I say, there's loads to choose from. So what can you do in this game? Well, P2P, cooperative raids, and it's all open world, so lots of different things, lots of danger, lots of rewards. It's a great game to explore. It's also a game that's super easy to get into. You can just load up and start playing, but it's also a bit tricky to master, so there's lots of space for developing skills. It's lots of fun, it's free, it's a great way to support Today I Found Out. You can get a Black Hawk spaceship for free and 3 days of account boost just by clicking the link below to get started. And let's get into those bonus facts. Given AM radio signals can propagate for thousands of miles via the aforementioned skywaves, particularly at night, this can become a major problem, as there are only a little over 100 allowed AM radio frequencies. These are restricted to keep them from interfering too much with one another. However, there are 5,000 AM radio stations in the United States alone. As a result, at night, AM stations in the United States typically reduce their power and go off the air completely until sunrise the next day. They also sometimes have to use directional antennas so their specific signal doesn't interfere with other stations on the same frequency. On the other hand, FM stations don't have to do this, as the ionosphere doesn't greatly affect their signals, which has the side benefit, or disadvantage depending on your point of view, of severely limiting the range of FM signals which rely on ground wave propagation. And now for another bonus fact. Speaking of radio and space, while not a job ever mentioned by the career counselor at school, it turns out space DJ is totally a thing if you work at NASA. This goes all the way back to 1965 during the Gemini 6 mission on December the 16th, likely initially as a joke. During this mission, astronauts Walter Schirra and Tom Stafford were woken up by a recording of singer Jack Jones and Hello Dolly. The musical wake-up call quickly became a regular occurrence, intended as a way of bolstering morale while allowing astronauts a few minutes to wake up slowly before having to respond to ground control. Over the years, wake-up calls became one of NASA's most beloved traditions, with the role of picking the songs given to the mission's capsule commander, that's Capcom. Yes, just to be clear, not only do these people get to put Capcom for NASA on their resumes, but they can also add in Space DJ. If you're wondering, the songs chosen over the years have been wildly eclectic, ranging from classical music music by composers like Bach and Beethoven to Metallica and the Beastie Boys. Thanks to the extensive records NASA keeps, we not only know every song played for astronauts in orbit since 1965, we also have the astronauts' responses to some of the more unusual choices that were played. For example, for a 2008 mission aboard the Space Shuttle Atlantis, officially designated as STS-123, Capcom played a brief snippet of the theme song from the presumably epic film Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla, as well as part of the Blue Oyster Cult song Godzilla for Japanese astronaut Takao Doi, signing off by saying, "Good morning, Endeavour. Doi-san Ohio Gozaimasu from Mission Control here in Houston. Take on today like a monster." An amused Doi responded that he was happy to hear Godzilla before himself signing off to get to work. According to Fry's extensive archives, Godzilla's iconic theme song is apparently a popular choice for Japanese astronauts, as are the themes from other well-known films like Star Wars, Star Trek, and Rocky. Predictably, songs with a space theme are also popular choices, with David Bowie's Space Odyssey and Elton John's Rocket Man being noted as some of the most commonly played. In addition to songs, NASA has at various points played private messages recorded by the astronauts' loved ones, including the occasional singing of Happy Birthday when applicable. Also, there have been occasional messages from celebrities. Notable examples of the latter include a personal greeting from William Shatner, Paul McCartney, and Elton John, a skit performed by Jim Henson involving Miss Piggy, and a song sung by Darth Vader set to backing music from the Beatles. Perhaps best of all was the crew of Atlantis on November 25, 1991, being awoken by none other than Patrick Stewart, stating, with Star Trek The Next Generation theme music playing in the background, "Space, the final frontier. This is the voyage of the Space Shuttle Atlantis, its 10-day mission to explore new methods of remote sensing and observation of the planet Earth, to seek out new data on radiation in space, and a new understanding of the effects of microgravity on the human body. To boldly go where 250 men and women have gone before." Hello Fred, Tom Story, Jim, Tom, and especially Mario. This is Patrick Stewart, choosing not to outrank you as Captain Jean-Luc Picard, saying that we are confident of a productive and successful mission. Make it so. As for today, with the retirement of the Space Shuttle program, this wake-up call tradition has partially been left in the dustbin of history, though occasionally is still observed on the International Space Station and presumably will be reinstated as a regular activity once NASA begins sending people to space themselves again. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do smash that like button below, and don't forget to check out our sponsor Star Conflict. Click that link below, and as always, thank you for watching.